Welcome to Cryptic Accounts, a podcast by paranoid people and for paranoid people. I'm your host for this week, Dennis Cheney, and I'm joined as always with Patrick Ryan. How are you doing, Patrick?
I'm good, Dennis. Good to be here.
It's nice to see you. We're doing Egyptians in the New World today.
I'm sure you're gonna find some weird way to upset me with this.
Actually, I don't know. I think this is just kind of interesting, or at least
Yeah,
I found it interesting. I don't know if there's some intrigue, but I don't really get into it. Like from what I can tell, everything I've ever read about archaeology, there's some sort of like archaeology hierarchy that just like doesn't want you to know the truth. Like especially whenever it comes to Egypt, which is really weird.
like archaeology, Illuminati.
Hmm. They be out here, man. But I got the book. It's called Discovering the Mysteries of Ancient America. Lost history and legends, unearthed and explored, and it goes into everything. It goes into like did the Vikings end up in like Minnesota? Like did Chinese people like end up in Africa? What are some like weird legends and stuff? But kept finding like this thread of stuff about Egyptians going to South America, and I was like, I want to look into this, and so that's the show we ended up with. Sometimes it happens that way.
Right on.
Yeah. So if you're watching this or listening to this, it is after the election. We should say
Yes.
it's the day after. So,
So half the country is super upset, and the other half's who knows.
I know.
Happy, I guess. Maybe.
I might be killed in street violence. I don't know at
That's
this point.
very true.
This might be the last time you ever
This
see my
might be a
face.
last will and testament. So hit the subscribe button for us. We'd appreciate that. Write a nice review that we can, read at the funerals.
Yes,
I'm
please
always
do.
looking for new stuff to add to Dennis's eulogy. So
Please do. Yes, he is. It kind of bothers me, but
it
it's going to be like a book at this point. So,
is pretty long. I hate deleting parts. It's all good.
you're just good at what you do, man, and
It's
describing
all
my
wheat, no chaff in there. I just got to keep it. It may be 5 or 6 pages long at this point. That's fine.
Yeah, and you're going to be the star. You're going to be the headliner of my funeral.
Oh, I better headline that funeral.
Well, let's get started, Patrick.
Scare me with Egyptians. Let's go, Dennis.
So we're going to start with Zachariah Sitchin, who is a prolific researcher and author. He was born in 1920 and lived until 1910. He's an interesting dude. He was born in the USSR to a Jewish family. He ended up graduating from the London School of Economics. He worked as a journalist in what would become Israel, but at the time was Palestine. And he's just kind of this like polymath. He's into all this different type of stuff. And while he was out in Palestine, he took like his days off and stuff, and also some of his assignments to visit like a ton of archaeological sites in the Middle East. And this guy is most famous for teaching himself Sumerian cuneiform, which is like their writing they did on their tablets. He taught himself the language, eventually ended up in New York, where he started writing about the Anunnaki and Nibiru, and he basically started that whole movement.
Ooh, is this okay?
Yeah. And so we're not doing the Anunnaki and Nibiru.
Oh,
This is like a side project of this dude. He just did everything. But
we're talking about that. I was gonna say when you said the name, it sounded really familiar, and I was trying to connect it. And as soon as you said Anunnaki and Nibiru, I'm like, oh yeah, that guy. Okay.
yeah, this is the guy who thinks that like all the Sumerian gods were like aliens, and that we're a slave race that was created like mine gold and stuff, and they're coming back. But he also was interested in early American civilization, and he wrote quite a bit on it. And he says that more than 1,500 years before the Maya flourished in Central America, 25 centuries before the Aztecs conquered large swaths of Mexico, there existed the mysterious Olmec people, who were building the first great culture of Mesoamerica. Starting in 1200 BC, in the steamy jungles of Mexico's southern Gulf Coast, the Olmec's influence spread as far as modern Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, Costa Rica, and El Salvador. They built large settlements, established the elaborate trade routes, and developed religious iconography and rituals, including ceremonial ball games, bloodletting, and human sacrifice, that were adopted by the Aztec and Maya. So this is like the OGs of like South America.
Yeah.
They were like the first they were, I guess, just like considered the first like actual civilization. Like before this, it was all like hunter gatherer and stuff like that. But they were like some like little pre-Olmec civilizations, and we don't know a lot about them. And we don't know. One of the things we don't know is basically why they vanished around 300 BC. They just kind of up and
And that
disappeared.
seems to happen to a lot of these early South American cultures. Like, we don't really know what happened to a lot of them.
Yeah, they're almost like the like Atlantis of like South America. Like they were advanced, they existed, they thrived, and then they're just gone. And they were replaced, by the Aztecs and the Mayans eventually. But
Who eventually disappear on their own.
well, we helped with that a little bit.
Well, that's true. I guess that's true. This one's a little bit more mysterious.
This one, yeah, this one's kind of like nobody really knows. So Zachariah Sitchin showed that civilization on the South American continent is, in fact, maybe 15 centuries older than what archaeologists had believed. This more profound antiquity places prehistoric America squarely within the contemporary rise of high culture in the Nile Valley in Mesopotamia, where Egyptian and the Sumerian civilizations did indeed share some provocative similarities with the ancient Mexicans. He helped prove this findings by using carbon-14 science as well as other methods.
And there's a lot of like the way they built structures and stuff has a lot of similarities that are kind of like, do y'all know each other or?
Yeah, and I didn't know this, but like, how they both built pyramids?
Yeah.
Apparently, like the three pyramids we always see in Egypt are just one of like, or just three of like
the Giza pyramids, I think.
Yeah, but there's like a ton more. And apparently the rest of them are almost all step pyramids. They almost all look like the stuff in South America. And the stuff they're building in like Mesopotamia and like Sumeria and stuff all look like that as well. So
I would and they promote the ones that they promote because I think those are the ones that are unique to them. You don't really find that kind of structure of a pyramid other places.
But
I think they're bigger than a lot of the other ones too.
Oh yeah, they're huge. Yeah, but mostly what you would find is like a typical Egyptian pyramid looks almost exactly like what you'd see in South America.
Yeah.
And this is coupled by some other weird stuff. Like I included here, maybe we'll put it on the show notes, those big famous heads that the Mayans made.
Yeah.
And a lot of people think those look African, basically. And there's not really, it's just kind of an argument of what you think they look like. But a lot of researchers have said these look African. We need to figure out like why. And they kind of do. I looked at a lot of them, but
yeah, I could see that. I don't know.
I could see it. It's a little more arguable. I think the pyramids is a bigger. So we've basically arbitrarily named them the Olmec because we don't know much about them. And Sitchin considered this academically embarrassing because we don't know basically where they came from, how they got started. And it's also very strange that they appear possibly to have rose right at the height of these cultures that were across the ocean. So if the Olmec people represented the earliest or mother civilization of Mesoamerica, the day of their arrival was at first determined to be about 250 BC. However, the most recent carbon dating that's accepted by most of scientists have put it at 1500 BC, and Sitchin argues it's at least twice that old. He concludes that the presence of the Olmec in the New World go back at least 5,000 years to around 3000 BC. And that's around the time the Pharaohs were big. And this was reached by numerous paths. The first was an attempt to identify the great god of Mesoamerica, known as the Feathered Serpent, who promised to return on the first day of the 52-year cycle. He was known as Quetzalcoatl to the Aztecs and Kukulkan to the Mayas. In 1519 AD, the Aztec Emperor Montezuma II, more commonly remembered as Montezuma, mistakenly believed that the Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez was the returned man god because he arrived on the Atlantic shores of Mexico on the anticipated sacred date near Veracruz, the same place where Quetzalcoatl was said to have landed. And I think we've mostly all learned that in history, that when Cortez showed up, they thought he was like the return of some god.
Yeah.
But I guess this god goes back to the Olmec culture, and it kind of influenced the Aztecs and Mayans. So in the Lost Realms, devoted to the prehistory of the Americans, Sitchin suggested that the arrival of the Olmec and the Feathered Serpent might be established by convincing precision. The key to unlocking the enigma is found in the Olmec calendar itself, in addition to a practical calendar of 365 days, called in Mayan the Hab. The peoples of Mesoamerica employed a sacred calendar called the Tzolk'in of 260 days. It's said to consist of two wheels with meshing teeth that turned and returned to the same spot once every 52 years. And this is a very famous calendar. I'm sure I can get a picture of this up online too. It's that famous round thing that we all thought the world was going to end in 2012. Yeah. And so the 52 years, that was the sacred numeral of the winged serpent deity, and also the holy numeral of a man god known to the Egyptians as Thoth. Thoth, like Quetzalcoatl, was the divine patron of science and the calendar, and had been exiled from Egypt around 3100 BC. Stitchin suggests, therefore, that this figure was not entirely legendary, but an actual culture bearer who led a group of his followers from Egypt to the new land, bringing the Olmec to Middle America.
Okay.
In addition to the Hab and the Tzolk'in, there was a third calendar in the Olmec culture used to inscribe dates on monuments called the, quote, long count. It was not critical as where the other two, but it was not circular, or cyclical as the other two, but was linear, counting consecutively the total number of days that had passed since the original counting began on a mysterious day one. And I always think that's weird. Like a lot of cultures have this. I guess we kind of do too. We just count from Jesus onward, but a lot of cultures have like a day one, and they've kind of like forgot where it comes from.
Well, I was thinking about that as you were explaining, like there are three calendars. I'm like, why would you have three different calendars? It's because it's probably easier to just repeat something like that if you're looking for a certain schedule than to mark things out on a calendar it's, you know what I mean? It's going to end up at the 7th month on this calendar.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of cultures had different calendars. Like you
hit this mark at the end of it every time.
Right. I mean, it might not be that different than how we count like centuries, or we have like, I don't know, like we have calendars of like elections, like there's an election every 4 years, or you know what I mean? Like it's different, but like a lot of different cultures have sacred
but
calendars.
It's not counting down the days in that 4 years and then it restarts at 0 again. Like that isn't how that calendar works. It's just showing what years it's going to be and highlights them.
Yeah.
So like their own thing, like at the end of this 90 or 54 years, this dude shows up. So we count this specific calendar 54 times, or once. Maybe it's just once for that calendar.
Yeah, I don't know what the deal was with calendars. I guess you just had, you had more to do, I guess, back then. There were more things to wait for or do or like count things.
I'm just trying to think of like, that's the only reason I can come up with is that it's easier from like a record keeping perspective on like, that way you don't have to keep track of how many of these calendars have gone. You know what I mean? You don't have to keep track of the 52 or whatever. Right. You just got this long count going.
Yeah, that's probably, I'm sure there's a lot of practical purposes. It might be no different than either. Like, I'm sure.
That being said, by next week, I will be introducing 5 new calendars for the show, which will have a variety of lengths and purposes. But I will be signing checks and everything from now on with my new dating system.
Okay, just every 52 years we get paid. So
well, no, I just count the day, and then it's going to be a whole thing. Don't worry, I'll bring a chart.
Make sure it's like a big circle calendar. They love calendaring, but I don't know. So anyway, for whatever reason, they have
everybody's got their hobby, man. Don't get all judgy.
They just loved calendars. So we're looking for like, what is this day one? Like, when did it occur? What's its significance? And it's been established beyond doubt that the long count version was the original Olmec calendar. And it's now generally agreed that day one was equivalent to about August 13th, 3113 BC. So again, we go back to about the 3000 BC mark. But what did that day signify to the Olmec? The only plausible answer, says Stitchin, must be the date of Quetzalcoatl's arrival on the Atlantic shores of Mexico, near present-day Veracruz. Surprisingly, a book written by Gordon Cooper called A Leap of Faith. Gordon Cooper, he was a Mercury 7 astronaut.
Yeah.
Kind of gives credence to this theory. So, Gordon Cooper wrote in his book, during my final years with NASA, I became involved in a different kind of adventure, undersea treasure hunting in Mexico. Accompanied by a National Geographic photographer, Cooper and his companions landed in a small plane on the island in the Gulf of Mexico. Local residents showed him some pyramid shaped mounds where they found pre Columbian ruins, artifacts, and bones. Upon examination in Texas by chemical analysis, the artifacts were determined to be 5,000 years old. So around 300 BC, 3000 BC.
3000.
When we learned the age of the artifacts, Cooper writes, we knew that what we'd found had nothing to do with 17th century Spain. I contacted the Mexican government and was connected to the head of the National Archaeology Department, Pablo Bush Romero. Together with Mexican archaeologists, the two returned to the site. Cooper writes, the age of the ruins was confirmed to be 3000 BC. Compared with other advanced civilizations, relatively little was known about the one called the Olmec. Engineers, farmers, artisans, and traders, the Olmec had a remarkable civilization, but it's still not known from where they originated. Among the findings that intrigued Cooper were the celestial navigation symbols and formulas that, when translated, turned out to be mathematical formulas still used for navigation.
Hmm.
There were also accurate drawings of constellations, some of 20 discovering of constellations, some of them not officially discovered until the age of modern telescopes. And this led Cooper wondering, why would you have celestial navigation signs if you weren't navigating celestially, or more or less sailing? And Cooper asked, if someone had helped the Olmecs with this knowledge, who were they? So an answer to this was found at Jalapa's outstanding Museum of Olmec Civilization in the Veracruz province of East Coastal Mexico. Featured there is a wall panel showing the extent and dates of Mexico's various pre-Columbian cultures. On Cooper's first visit to the institution, he could hardly believe his eyes. The first and therefore earliest civilization, that of the Olmec, was shown as beginning at 3000 BC. And then also Stitchin took a trip to this place as well. And Stitchin says, I urged the members of my tour group to take photos of me pointing to the date. On a second visit to the museum, however, the column indicating the Olmec's fourth millennium beginnings had been removed. The official museum catalog concerning the Olmecs reverted to the previous 1500 BC date. But Gordon Cooper reports, as a professionally trained eyewitness, that he mistakenly learned from the chief Mexican archaeologist, namely that the Olmec material dated to 3000 BC. And the same moment, another great and apparently related civilization suddenly arose in the Nile Valley. Was Egypt's Thoth, the feathered serpent of Mesoamerica? Their shared mission and time frame is far more than coincidental. So that's basically where Stitchin begins. And from here, we'll kind of go in and out of Stitchin stuff and more into like recent findings and stuff. But just basically here, we're just looking for evidence that like either Egypt contacted the Olmec or that they both started around 3000 BC, if that makes sense. And for some reason, this is like hotly, like anytime they find something like this, like the people, like the archaeologists want to like shut it up, or they basically don't pay attention to it, which I never got, because I've heard that about Egypt too. Like they'll find something that doesn't make any sense and people just kind of ignore it. I don't know what the basis is for that. I don't know if it's you already published so much literature that you don't want to look silly or be way off or whatever, but
maybe is that they'd have to rethink a bunch of different stuff if this other I don't know, it just seems like a weird approach. It doesn't seem like there's a good explanation for it.
No, and I'm not an archaeologist. Maybe maybe it just takes a lot more, but this is interesting. So apparently so far we have the fact that their calendar appears to start around the same date, that the similar guy was exiled from Egypt. We also know that they probably had the same name for their primary god, the sun god. There were many tribes in the New World, and they had many names for the sun god. Some of those names have been lost because of the ravages of disease on the native populations and fading into memories of passing generations. However, the Egyptian god Ra, or Re for the sun, has survived the millennia as testimony of Egyptian culture influence in ancient American. Archaeologist Kurt Mercer reported that the Ra glyph at Teotihuacan, Mexico, which is the site of the enormous Pyramid of the Sun. This important glyph includes a scroll and an eye motif inside of a circle. Both Mercer and Mexican archaeologist Alfonso Caso identified the Ra glyph through ethnographical research as a eye of a serpent. Native artists at the temple placed the Ra glyphs at the center of the solar symbols to represent the eye of the sun. Egyptian artists use a similar symbol consisting of the hawk serpent eye placed inside a symbol of the sun. And I think we've all seen this in like
Yeah, and it pops up a lot in Central America, it seems like, and even some of like southern, like Western America, like Southwest America.
yeah, and it's like virtually similar to Ra, virtually
Yeah.
the exact same as what the Egyptians have on their thing. But they also called it Ra or Re, the eye of the sun. Presence of similar symbols with identical names is strong evidence of cultural diffusion. Thus, two reputable archaeologists, Kurt Mercer and Alfonso Caso, have established that some of the inhabitants of Mexico knew their sun god by the Egyptian name Ra, although later Mexicans chose different names for the deity. Egyptians' motifs or native art include the serpent apron of fertility seen on Maya statues, the Aztec sun god holding an incense burner in the same manner of Egyptian sun gods or pharaohs hold incense burners, and Mixtec serpents headdresses that parallel those of the pharaohs and queens of Egypt. Some Olmec statuettes have stylized beards below their chins that mimic the false beards of Egyptian pharaohs. And this is pretty weird. They found these artifacts that look basically identical to like Egyptian and Mesopotamia or like Sumerian artifacts. One of the important finds of Egyptian artifacts occurred in 1914 in El Salvador. Since then, it's been largely ignored by academics in the United States. During the course of the controlled archaeological excavations under the direction of Professor Miguel Gonzalez, workers uncovered two Egyptian statuettes buried far beneath the surface. One of the statuettes is of a pharaoh's sarcophagus or mummy wearing the crown of Osiris, god of resurrection. The other appears to be the mother goddess Isis. An inscription on the male statuette approximates the cartouche of Pharaoh Orserkon in the 22nd dynasty circa 1000 BC. Photographs of these artifacts were published in a Mexican historical manual that was written by the Jesuit priest Manuel Surveys. He was convinced of the authenticity of the artifacts and their importance to ancient New World history, yet the bias of American scholars against anything that might support pre-Columbian contact with the Old World resulted in a failure to consider this evidence. And I included a picture of this if
Yeah,
you want to look at it.
they do look very similar. I mean, different materials, obviously. One looks like a golden sort of thing, and the other one's, I realize it's probably a black and white photo, but it doesn't look like it looks like stone, probably.
Yeah,
Very similar shape.
similar shape. They also have similar inscriptions like on their legs. The scholars, like when you read stuff like this, they make a big deal out of how their hands are placed, like over their chests. And another big deal does seem to be this like ceremonial beard that like the leaders would wear, because I guess the people in like Aztec times, like they did not have beards. They did not wear beards. Like the leaders would wear a fake beard though, just like the Egyptians.
Yeah, I didn't know that, and that is very odd that they would also share that similarity.
And now we'll get into one of the funner pieces of evidence. Other evidence of Egyptian contact continues to accumulate, and it's picked up here in like the last half century. In 1994, George Carter noted the presence of tobacco and cocaine in ancient Egyptian mummies. These Native American plants were tentatively identified by a team of German microbiologists, and other researchers found the American tobacco beetle in King Tut's tomb. Were South Americans providing drug plants to inhabitants of the Nile Valley 3,000 years ago? Did trade routes connect the ancient empires of the Egyptians and Inca? I see that you want to say something. What do you what do you think?
Well, I mean, I'm just like, man, so they were drug carteling way before I thought they were drug carteling.
Yeah, this was like the original South American.
Like they pretty much figured out cocaine was the thing like way long ago, and they're like, we can sell this to literally everybody.
Oh yeah, we'll sell it to places we don't even know exist, man. We'll
So
sell it to the
Egyptians
gods.
brought them like gods and like building technology, and
And
they
took
gave
the
them
cocaine.
coke and tobacco.
So these reports from German scholars is rekindling debate. Researchers at the Institute of Anthropology and Human Genetics at the University of Munich have detected cocaine and nicotine in the tissue of Egyptian mummies. These surprising results are difficult to explain. Cocaine and nicotine are members of the chemical class of compounds known as alkaloids, and the cocoa plant was unknown to the old world until the first Spanish expeditions to South America during the 15th and 16th centuries.
So rich people have pretty
However,
much been partying the same way for like all of time.
oh yeah, and this yeah they got their and I don't know if they really shared this with anyone else. Must have been like a really important commodity. They probably wouldn't talk about it a lot. All these mummies, by the way, date to at least around 1000 BC,
Very skinny mummies.
and it's not just tobacco and cocaine; it's also THC. So Dr. Svetla Valvanova was left in total disbelief when she saw results of her analysis.
Just a mummy holding a bong.
Yeah, pretty much. And people try to, well, we'll get into it. But the prestigious German medical examiner had been commissioned to analyze several mummies looking for traces of drug use and the rulers of ancient Egypt. What she found is considered to be a history changer. After analyzing several ancient mummies, the researchers discovered the presence of high levels of cocaine, nicotine, and THC in the bodies that were preserved for thousands of years. None of these things exist outside of South America, at least at this time. With scientific rigor, Dr. Balvanoa repeated the test several times and sent samples to other laboratories for independent testings. All successive analysis confirmed the initial results. Ancient Egyptian mummies had high levels of cocaine, nicotine, and THC, but where did the ancient Egyptians obtain the products from? Despite finding evidence, the scientific community remained skeptical, accusing the researchers who had made the discovery of incompetence. They began by stating that the mummies were false until they were proven to be authentic. Then they went on to argue that they were contaminated until it was shown that it was impossible to contaminate the inner stem of a hair. Then they claimed that the experiments were not reproducible until an independent group of experts also found traces of cocaine and nicotine and other Egyptian mummies in a British museum. So these mummies were doing cocaine. We don't know, you know. What gets me though is that like we basically proved this because you can't, they're doing like hair studies of hair that's been dead for like 1,000 years. Like,
yeah,
you can't contaminate these things that way. So that either means that we're completely wrong about what drugs were available in Africa 3,000 years ago, or they were sailing and getting some drugs. Either way, you're wrong. But it's like scientists just can't be wrong. So they just say, no, they can't be that. No evidence, there is no evidence of coca or tobacco cultivation ever found in Africa, Europe, or Asia before the time of Christopher Columbus. What the mummies tell us is an intolerable story for history as we've learned it in school. Cocoa and tobacco, and apparently weed, are undoubtedly originating in South America. The Egyptians apparently had the ability to build pyramids, but did they have sufficient navigational skills to cross the Atlantic Ocean?
It's seeming like yes.
Yeah, it is kind of seeming like yes, and it's crazy. I mean,
they made
also,
one trip and found like those 3 drugs, and they're like, "Oh, so we're gonna come back like every 3 months or so, pick up another shipment."
This is like exactly too because like the scientists just keep saying like there's not enough. It's like almost like they want to find like a bunch of Egypt stuff here and a bunch of South American stuff here. But if you think about it, this is almost 5,000 years ago. If you're traveling all the way across the ocean, the things that are going to last are religion and drugs, man. It's going to be like the big stuff. Like you're not going to find a bunch of like axes and things. Like we don't find that stuff, practically anywhere anyway.
Yeah.
Like we're finding weird language stuff, weird religion stuff, and somehow these mummies are doing lines. So who knows? Now, at least one professor, Barry Fell, um, uh, he's kind of a lot of these guys are kind of wild cards. They like are highly like have high achievement in one area, but they like get into this topic because it like super interests them.
I like to call them the Cryptic Crew.
They are the Cryptic Crew. And Barry Fell was a zoology professor at Harvard, but he also had a interest in what they call pseudo-archaeological work in New World ethnography, arguing that various inscriptions in the Americas are best explained by extensive pre-Columbian contact with Old World civilizations.
Man, that's a very specific side project.
It is. He studies primarily starfish and sea urchins was his job.
Well, I could see how you could get bored with that and look for other things.
He had to have something to keep him going.
Starfish and sea urchins.
Barry Fell demonstrated a probable Egyptian influence to glyph writing by the discoveries included Libyan writing on priestly robes at the Maya Ceremonial Center of Bonampak in the Yucatan.
Really?
Apparently the Egyptians would use Libyans as like surrogates for them, like in discovery missions and stuff.
Look, the Egyptians are pretty well known early on for being big fans of outsourcing a lot of work through force. Through force.
The original outsourcers. Isolationist scholars have entirely overlooked the Libyan writing at Bonampak because it, quote, does not fit into their preconceived notion about what Mayan writing is supposed to look like. Nevertheless, the foreign script is plain for all to see on the Bonampak murals, and in many textbooks having photographs of these murals. And I included a picture of these murals. I can't make out what's Mayan and what's Libyan, to be quite honest, but I'm going to trust the Harvard professor. Also, these murals, I mean, I know there's only so many of right people, but they do kind of remind me of like when you see like pyramid walls and stuff, like of just like people and stuff, like in these rows, like, but apparently there's some writing in there that you can see. Now, that's more or less the extent of like what physical evidence we have. Like we have these calendars that seem to match up with certain dates of Egyptian calendars. We have like a similar god. We have some writing. But what I wanted to know is, could these dudes sail across the ocean? Because you never see Egyptians on anything other than those like rowboats or whatever, like going down the Nile or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's true. But that was primarily, they were mainly traveling by a river, but they were also a really vast culture that was doing a lot of stuff back then.
They were, and I found
out.
So
to think that they weren't like, maybe colonizing isn't the right word, but exploring
and trading.
Yeah.
And essentially we find out that they were. So some people have insisted that Africans couldn't have made it to the New World simply because they didn't have the skill and resources to sail across the Atlantic. But as it turns out, that's completely false. Historians have discovered evidence that suggests Africans were masters of building ships and that it was actually a part of their tradition. Shipbuilding and sailing are over 20,000 years old in the Sahara, and cave wall paintings of ancient ships were displayed in the National Geographic magazine. With those shipbuilding skills and the navigation skills that were noted by other historians of the time, the myth that Africans wouldn't have been able to sail to the New World becomes officially debunked. As Dr. Julian Whitewright, a maritime archaeologist at the University of Southampton, explained, the voyage from Africa on ancient ships was quite a plausible undertaking based on the capabilities of the vessels of the period and historical material stating it took place. So I Googled this and I immediately found a kind of a fun side story. So a few years ago, actually 2019, and I don't think they've completed this project yet, a group decided that they were going to try to sail like 900 miles in like an Egyptian ship.
Okay. And they're still going?
Yeah, I couldn't find if they completed the journey. So what we do know is that there was a Greek scholar named Herodotus who did claim that the Egyptians had basically mastered nautical navigation and that they would sail through the Black Sea to get stuff from about 900 miles away. Or it's about 800 to 900 miles. And so this group of researchers took out to embark on this 800-mile journey from the Black Sea to Crete in August of 2019 aboard a vessel built from materials available at the time of the Egyptians. The voyage is called the Abora 4 and is set to prove whether or not ancient Egyptians could have made similar trips in reed boats thousands of years ago. And these boats are about 46. They base these off basically Egyptian drawings. They're about 46 feet long, crewed by 24 researchers. So you could have quite a bit of a crew. You could send like 25 people on this big boat and go close to 1,000 miles. And it said if the name of these researchers, it mentions one guy named Dr. Gorlitz, sounds familiar, it's because his father participated in a similar journey in 1970 across the Atlantic to prove the same thing. And so I've included here a picture of what this boat looks like, and this is virtually similar to what they've already proven, I guess, in the 70s. And so then I had to go out and be like, what did we do in the 70s? And it turns out they built the darn boat and sailed across the Atlantic in it like 50 years ago. It was a man named Thor Heyerdahl. He was a Norwegian adventurer and ethnographer with a background in zoology and botany and geography. In 1969 and 1970, Heyerdahl built 2 boats from papyrus, which that just blows my mind, and attempted to cross the Atlantic Ocean from Morocco and Africa. Based on drawings and models from the ancient Egypt, the first boat, named Ra, after the Egyptian sun god, was constructed by boat builders from Lake Chad using papyrus reed obtained from Lake Tana in Ethiopia and launched into the Atlantic Ocean from the coast of Morocco. The Ra crew included Thor and a few other shipmates. And after sailing for a number of weeks, Ra actually failed. It took water. Who would have thought a ship made out of paper would take water? The crew discovered that a key element of the Egyptian boat building methods had been neglected, and a tether that acted like a spring to keep the stern high in the water while allowing for the flexibility had basically been ignored. So they abandoned this and they tried again. So in 1970, they built Ra 2, also made from papyrus, and they did it using the same workers, and likewise set sail across the Atlantic from Morocco, this time with great success. The crew was mostly the same, although a couple people were replaced. However, this guy had some bad luck. The boat did become lost and was the subject of a United Nations search and rescue mission. The search included international assistance, including people as far afield as Lu Chi-hu of New Zealand. However, when they found the boat, it had reached Barbados, thus demonstrating that mariners could have dealt with transatlantic voyages sailing from the Canary Current.
That boat decided to do its own test.
It just did its own thing, man. They got lost, but they ended up in the New World. And these are people who are not used to it. And you see here, there's like, I included a picture of like one of these big, it's kind of like worn down because it's a really old Egyptian drawing, but one of these big old ships that they would have been sailing on with like sails and stuff like that. And you can see that it's really faded, but it's like 20 people with like what appears to be sails coming off this ship. And as we get further in history, it appears that we basically found out these people are doing this. And I included an article called Egypt's Ancient Fleet Lost for Thousands of Years, Discovered in a Desolate Cave. In an ancient harbor on the Red Sea, a finding proves that ancient Egyptians mastered ocean-going technology and launched a series of ambitious expeditions to far-off lands. The images carved into the wall of an ancient Egyptian temple at Deir el-Bahri tell of a remarkable sea voyage. A fleet of cargo ships bearing exotic plants, animals, and precious incense, which I'm pretty sure is THC, navigates through the high-crested waves on a journey from a mysterious land known as Punt, or the Land of God. These carvings were commissioned by one of Egypt's greatest female pharaohs, Hatshepsut, who controlled Egypt for more than 2 decades in the 15th century BC. She ruled so that would be, how many years ago would that be? That'd be about 3,000. Yeah, that'd be about 3,000 years ago. She ruled some 2 million people and oversaw one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world. Now, the exact meaning of the detailed carvings has divided Egyptologists ever since they were discovered in the mid 19th century. Some people have argued that Punt was inland and not at sea, or that Punt was a fictitious place altogether. Oxford Egyptologist John Bain said recently, however, a series of remarkable discoveries on the desolate stretch of the Red Sea coast has settled the debate, proving once and for all the masterful building skills of the ancient Egyptians applied to ocean going ships as well as pyramids. And so this is where they discovered a chamber. It's at a place called Mursa Gawasis. And basically inside this chamber, they kind of get in. It looked cramped. They found a gallery of about 15 feet across, some 70 feet long. Oh, sorry, a galley of 15 feet across, some 70 feet long, and tall enough for a short man to move through freely. The cave's entrance was reinforced with old ship timbers and reused stone anchors, the first conclusive evidence of a large-scale Egyptian seafaring ever discovered.
Hmm.
Evidence connecting Mursa Kwas to the mythical place called Punt piled up both inside and outside the caves. A few hundred yards from the cliffs, piles of crumpled stones and conch shells a few feet high are evidence of altars the seafarers built north of the harbor entrance. They include stones carved with inscriptions that specifically mention missions to Punt. Timbers and steering oars, similar to those on ships depicted in the Hatshepsut's wall carvings, were recovered in sand both inside and outside the caves. Many of the artifacts were riddled with telltale holes made by saltwater shipworms. And as if this weren't enough, among the remnants of 40 smashed and empty crates found outside one caves were 2 sycamore planks marked with directions for assembling a ship. One of them bore an inscription, still partly legible after 3,800 years. Quote, year 8 under Her Majesty the King of the Upper and Lower Egypt, given life forever of wonderful things of Punt. And he's talking about that cocaine.
Sounds like it.
Some scientists think the ship could go 2,200 miles round trip, which would be enough to reach the New World. And so I wanted to know about Punt, and it might be the New World. It might also be Somalia. Most people think it's Somalia, but there are some carvings of people coming back from Punt with what looks like corn. There's one that looks like a pineapple. Both of these things would have only been in the New World. In an article called it's in Spanish, so I'm not going to. But it's in a 1976.
You're not going to read us a Spanish article now?
No, I'm not going to read the name of the article.
Oh, okay.
But
I thought you meant the whole article was in Spanish.
Yeah, we're doing the final part of the show in Spanish. A researcher named Paul Galez offers a new interpretation of the Punt evidence. He locates the land of Punt in South America, probably in the Puno region of Peru, on the shores of Lake Titicaca. 70% of Peru's annual gold production comes from there, together with antimony, mercury, zinc, tin, and cobalt. Old gold and antimony mines can be found in the area, though archaeologists disagree as to their exact age. The boats used to sail on Lake Titicaca, made of a long-stemmed reed grassy plant, are so similar to those used in ancient Egypt that when Thor made his journeys in 1969 and 1970, he actually used people from the region to help him build the boat. So we need not be surprised at all this, since long ago in the 19th century BC, Pharaoh Sinsret II built a canal that connected the River Nile to the Reed Sea, a canal which was survived until the present day as an irrigation canal. And Herodotus, the Greek philosopher, tells us that the pharaoh Necho II set out a fleet which took 3 years to circumnavigate Africa. And I got some pictures of corn there, and that's the evidence. Basically, that's the controversy.
I mean, I'm pretty convinced at this point. Egyptians definitely went other places and
why wouldn't you?
Traded stuff for coke and tobacco and weed.
Yeah, they got that coke somehow. I don't know why you wouldn't. I mean, we basically know they were sailing like 900 miles through that one sea. Uh,
They found a magic plant that can make it so they can just stay up all the time and sail.
I mean, I'd call that place the land of God too, man. If you found all this stuff, like
You don't have to eat.
no, yeah, it's like being
Just
mummy
pure
already.
energy. Plant of the
PhD.
gods. And then we got this other one for when we want to sleep. We smoke that.
It's pretty incredible. Yeah, they so I don't know. I know this isn't like a spooky episode. I wanted
No,
to
this
do
is
something about America because it's election week, and I'm like, I somehow ended up on
this was your approach to election week?
well, I wanted to do like pre-Columbian things, like the Vikings or like, but I got into this Egyptian stuff and I was like, oh, I think this might be real. And so I just kept reading and like collecting sources on it.
You
Like
just slowly drifted south with your research and ended up in South
I somehow
America.
ended up in
You're like the
Africa.
U.S. election.
But yeah, I didn't want to do anything political because everyone's gonna be tired of it. But I wanted to go, so that's how I ended up here. And I know it's a different type of episode, but it's technically a conspiracy because most archaeologists are like, just ignore this. They're just like,
Look, you don't got to defend it. I mean, it's very weird. It's just not your typical upsetting content that you like to do to me and break my spirit while we record it.
I'm trying to give you a week off, Patrick.
I appreciate it. There's enough soul crushing going on this week, I think.
I love stuff like this. I don't know if I've ever told you, but one of my first books I ever read that got me into like reading stuff like this was Ancient America. It might have been by this Frank Joseph guy, but it was a different book. It was more about like, have you ever heard about that, like that lighthouse that was on Benedict Arnold's property that a lot of people think was built by? There's like this lighthouse that's on Benedict Arnold property, and it's like really controversial because some people say he built it, and then he's like, I didn't build it, and then like a lot of people say it's like a big Viking structure, basically, like way far south from where they should be, like in basically America.
Well, I'm not that surprised. I mean, we know the Vikings were moving around doing all kinds. It just doesn't surprise me, and it's weird that there's a controversy behind it.
Yeah, well, you think at least you would like, well, to be honest, one thing I did find reading this is that maybe this will be upsetting to you. Like, when you get into anything about this, you find like a lot of racial infighting. Like, there are a lot of people who are just like, how dare you suggest like my people that like we needed help with like building a pyramid or any of this stuff. You know what I mean? Like, they're offended that you're trying to bring like another culture into like Mesoamerican culture. And then there's like this whole other movement of like Afrocentric historians and stuff who are like, Africans were everywhere, every culture was started by Africa, and like these Olmecs are black people, and like, so there's like a lot of like really kind of touchy stuff. I didn't get into it in any of the show, but like it was definitely in like half the stuff I read. Like it was definitely like somebody had a dog in the fight as to like dealing with like racial stuff. Like, but really, if you just look at the evidence, like I'm not saying they went, but like I don't see why they wouldn't. If they were already sailing 1,000 miles to get stuff from Greece or whatever.
Yeah, you'd think you'd send people out to explore.
They circumnavigated Africa like 3,000 years ago. Like you think you'd go explore. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, this is it's a weird, yeah, people get touchy on this type of stuff, but I just think it's interesting. So
it is.
I hope you enjoyed your week off, Hamburger.
I did. Thank you for putting it together.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you all so much for listening. Like, rate, subscribe, put some comments in, tell a friend, send it to somebody. We appreciate it. It helps us out a lot.
Yeah, please share the show, tell someone. Yeah, thanks for listening.
And if you haven't checked out the first episode of Cryptic Experiences on this feed, go back and check that out. It's our first interview with the paranormal experiencer. And it turned out really well. And also, if you've had some kind of a weird experience and want to talk about it, you should get in touch with us through email accounts cryptic@gmail.com or through Facebook or Twitter or wherever you follow us. Basically, get in touch with us there and tell us about the weird thing that happened to you because we'd like to hear about it. Maybe we'll
any weird thing. I'll do Bigfoot.
Yeah, UFOs, aliens, anything fringe that's pseudoscience, we're probably in.
Have you seen a chupacabra? I want to hear about that.
I would like to hear about that.
I would too, actually.
So thank
All
you all
right.
so much for listening, and we'll be back soon. Thank you. Love you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.